Bruce, who will be our main speakers for this session. And the session will feel very slightly different to some of the other sessions for two reasons. One is that there will be slightly more sharing of both autobiography as well as the content of direct research in this session, and also because what will happen is the two speakers will each present their material. Then there'll be an opportunity for them to engage each other in comment and dialogue, and then I'll open it out to the floor. So it'll feel just very slightly different from some of the other sessions. So very conversational. We hope that that means you will feel very free and very welcome to join in as well. And one of the reasons why we have this panel, which is connecting autobiography with the study, the scholarship that's emerging on the empirical study of Catholicism, is because we are, I think, at a really interesting critical moment for the development of scholarship in this area. Between the 1930s and the 1980s or 90s, there was the development of a very distinct empirical study, a sociology of Catholicism, with figures like Andrew Greeley in the US, Michael Hornsby-Smith, and Peter Coman in the UK. And there's been, in a sense, a lull between that generation of work and the next generation, which is, I think, what we see before us today. Interestingly, a more female and more lay generation as well. And so, whilst the work that I think both Tricia and Alana do is very much in debt, there's a kind of sense of deep continuity with that previous generation, and I think their presentations will make that clear. There is something genuinely new and fresh about the way in which they're combining disciplinary perspectives. We were saying before that we're three women from three different continents, trained both in theology and the social sciences, and attempting still, in the way that we inhabit our roles in universities, to bring those different disciplinary perspectives to bear, as well as seeking in our own work to do dialogue with those in other disciplines now as well. So I think there's a kind of freshness in the new generation approach, and I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to focus on a session that drew on both the content of the research and the stories, in a sense, of the research journeys themselves. So you're both very welcome, and we're very grateful that you were able to be with us. And I'm going to ask Alana to speak first, if that's okay. Alana is based at King's College in London. She has a really interesting background because she's been trained in civil service, in law, in theology, and also in history. She came to the UK in the early 2000s, is that right? To study at Oxford, and since then has been pursuing work at the interface of the sociology of religion, history, and also theology. So Alana, we're very much looking forward to what you've got to say to us.
So I was saying it's wonderful to be here, exciting to be part of a panel that is bringing together so many different disciplinary perspectives. And my title for this afternoon is, as you can see, thinking about how far we can go in terms of negotiating disciplinary boundaries, where the research has come from and where we find ourselves at the moment. So one of the most formative books I read when I was undertaking my DPhil on changes in English Catholics' devotional cultures, both before and after the Second Vatican Council, was sociologist priest Andrew Greeley's The Catholic Imagination. Within it, he argues, Catholics live in an enchanted world, a world of statues and holy water, stained glass and votive candles, saints and religious medals, rosary beads and holy pictures. But these Catholic paraphernalia are mere hints of a deeper and more pervasive religious sensibility, which inclines Catholics to see the holy lurking in creation. As Catholics, we find our houses and our world haunted by a sense that the objects, events, and persons, here's the relationality of the earlier session, of daily life are revelations of grace. And many, as I, might also hear within these passages remarkable echoes of the sentiments in the recent apostolic exhortation, though not the disparagement of Catholic gossip, one might say. And here, also thinking about the recall of the playful spirit that Sister Avril mentioned last night. Within Greeley's tour de force exploration of both the prosaic and the poetic strands of Catholicism, the sensibility and the socialisation of the faithful that is part of our lived tradition, he cautioned, when a church ceases to be the centre of events which bind together a sacred time and a sacred space through sacred narrative, it may be a beautiful, dignified, reverent place, but it isn't Catholic anymore. So here is an argument for a common shared spirituality that is living remembering, but also crucially doing work beyond aesthetics and beyond a purely subjective, individualistic, analogical imaginary. And in Greeley's concluding remarks, written on the cusp of the new millennium, decades after the Council and the encyclical Humanae Vitae, he forthrightly pronounced, "Those of you who insist that, because most Catholics now deny the right of their religious leaders to control their sexual lives, they are no different from Protestants, might want to ponder the question of whether there is more to the Catholic heritage than sex and authority." And here we're almost connecting up with the panel this morning too. In the most important matter, the uniquely Catholic view of God, their world, and the relationship between the two, these continue to be durable, unchanged, and probably unchangeable. So this is what we are for, rather than what we're against. I'm thinking about Lord Brennan's discussion last night. Now, I started with this because I think in those three quotations, one might almost find an encapsulation of some of the intellectual agendas that have been so formative in my work since they began in 2003 at Wadham College in Oxford. And some of the spiritual sort of and intellectual inspirations and interventions that I'm hoping to make. These started with a focus on post-conciliar devotional piety, but have recently, as I'll talk about, moved into research into what I am calling a Catholic sexology, or a distinctive Catholic approach to love, marriage, sexuality, and intimate relationships. And bearing in mind Greeley's caution that it's not all about sex and authority there too. So I'm commencing this talk quoting extensively from an American sociologist who himself employs an ethnographic methodology. You'll glean a sense of my own interdisciplinarity, or migration across boundaries, a rejection of disciplinary silos, and the creation of a creolized methodology that I espouse. And this, I'm going to argue, requires various literacies, sort of training in different disciplines. But also, in working in these spaces or these liminal positions, a process of translation. And the translation exercise, activity, I think is what's crucially needed to be able to bring to bear the fruits across different disciplines. So one of the themes of my presentation, I think the panel as a whole, Trish and I have sort of been communicating by email about this, is the need for a social scientific study of the Church to draw upon different academic traditions, to think about the empirical through multiple lenses, and to better appreciate the transnational dimensions of the Catholic communion. So often these discussions are confined or also reduced to national settings. Another strand of what I'm going to talk about touches upon the difficulties of such hybridity in a secular academy, with the pressure to specialise and compartmentalise. This is compounded by an increasingly functionalist, reductive academic culture encapsulated in ref and tef, but I won't go there, which enforces disciplinary boundaries and can prioritise certain presses, certain journals, certain research agendas that mean that the interdisciplinary approaches that I think are where the creative action is at is rendered really difficult in the current academy and creates disciplinary hierarchies too that are phenomenally disempowering. And finally, as a good feminist and a cultural historian, undergirding all these reflections is a reflexive acknowledgement of my own positionality, that my intellectual and religious formation and development within the Church, but also within my relationships within society, which as I've heard really, I think are inflected through this Catholic imaginary, have led me to these conclusions. So, as Anna said, we're going to start probably fairly untraditionally for an academic panel by thinking autobiographically through some of these journeys. So in my current incarnation, and I use the language of incarnation because it seems to encapsulate these sort of various modulations that I've had to go through. I'm a lecturer in modern British history at King's. I manifest in my teaching and basically my profile to the student body there as a historian of gender, a historian of sexuality, and a historian of modern London, as well as an oral history practitioner. So the extent to which I'm almost an undercover historian of religion or sociologist of religion in that guise. So a sort of slight tangent to these teaching portfolios, my research over the last decade has spoken into the fields of the sociology of religion and the history of religion. And both disciplines have changed considerably in this time. I'm going to tease a bit of that out in a moment. And I've tried, until relatively recently, to straddle both disciplines, But as I've said, and as I think will come out through Trish's paper too, the capacity to do that within the British context, because of the minority status of Catholicism and the need for Catholic academics or historians and academics of Catholicism to operate in a secular university, makes that really rather difficult. But as Anna alluded, my academic journey didn't start in Britain or in theology. My undergraduate degree was in an arts degree and a law degree at the University of Melbourne. And this included, I think crucially, when I thought reflexively about how I came to be here and asking the sorts of questions I do in my scholarship, through immersion and study of medieval and Italian Renaissance history, in which I was fascinated by issues related to religious ritual, to heresy, to heterodoxy, to Marian devotions, and to the sense of the laity within the medieval church. After careers in law and civil service, I returned to academia to undertake a master's in modern Australian history and Australian church history before my DPhil in modern British history at Wadham in Oxford. So as is obvious from this, my intellectual development has required a movement across historical and national contexts and across very broad chronologies. Though I would say now that an enduring fascination with ritual, religion, gender and morality has been a golden thread through all of those modulations. And this has meant, with respect to the study of modern British history, that I've come from a background that cut across dominant, traditional, almost common sense narratives about modern Britain and the place of Catholics within modern Britain, that meant that I could ask or approach these things with slightly new, from a different angle. Some of these sort of dominant sort of narratives, and here I'm going to almost reductively describe them, but there we go, is a narrative that talks about the secularisation of Britain with the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, and therefore the absence of religion as a force for dialogue in society in the 20th century. We see that in some strands of the sociology of religion through a fascination with religion by numbers and all of those debates around bottoms on pews, for example. But that notion of kind of the secularisation paradigm as being so formative until very recently. A narrative around the privatisation of religion with the Reformation that I think is also the rent in the sacred canopy that pushed religion to the margins. And a British Catholic history that is almost, in a way that was discussed last night, slightly apologetic in terms of a recusant past. Seeing Catholics as a minority and therefore their insertion in a dominant modern British narrative as either a kind of a chippy assertion of continuation and presence and resilience, or an apologetic tone in terms of sort of a former glory in where we are now. Moreover, most of my academic training, though most of my academic training has been in history, I did an MDiv in theology at the United Faculty of Theology in Melbourne, which was an ecumenical context, and in fact formation through a lot of Protestant systematic theology has been intensely important in terms of thinking about the modern and the 20th century British context before and after the Second Vatican Council. And to compound all of that, when I arrived in Oxford, I was told that modern British history stopped in 1918. So the extent to which I was working on the period from 1945 to 82, this was the near past or the recent memory, and certainly sociology as many of the history dons considered it. So in my doctoral studies, I tested my research contentions and found a home, and a happy home, almost in the British sociology religion context as a historian there, and religious studies conferences sympathetic to the study of anthropology. And that has led into a lot of work that I've done on pilgrimage and materiality. So the resulting doctorate that I produced, I termed a lived religious history, and I'll give you the cover up there. It's an exploration of modern British Catholicism between 1945 and 1982, and basically is charting the territory travelled from the Second World War to John Paul II's visit, the first visit of a pope to England since the Reformation, but more particularly exploring the devotional lives of English Catholics through that period and the difference, effectively the reception of the Second Vatican Council in terms of the everyday lives and faith and spirituality of English Catholics. thinking in that context about the ecumenical movement, the community's socio-economic mobility through education with the Butler Act, the rise of affluence, but also intense migration in that period. And so within that study, I used the metaphor of the Holy Family, thinking about kinship from the session this morning, as a trope, a metaphor to unpack various facets of English Catholic family life. Thinking about the notion of Christ as brother, and the movement from a sacrificial soteriology to an incarnational, much more Catholic social teaching inflected understanding of what Christ as brother means in our everyday lives and lived faith. Changes in the liturgy, understandings of the Eucharist and benediction. I think sort of intriguingly in the chapters on Mary, the ways in which Mary and Marian devotion through mostly Catholic Truth Society publications in the 1950s and 60s is presented as a modern British housewife in post-war Britain, the golden age of marriage. So in these texts, Mary is painted as a patient homemaker with hapless Joseph, burnt toast and a demanding baby Jesus. So I sought in this study to actually sort of sidestep really stale and I think debilitating debates about the theology of the Second Vatican Council, polarised by the binary between the traditionalists and the progressives, and by looking for continuity and change and the ways in which Catholic culture was transformed, is mutated, the ways in which the Catholic imaginary is active and moving. I hope to make a contribution that actually moves slightly out of the hermeneutics of continuity debate that so characterises discussions around Vatican II. So from this initial embarkation, how has my engagement with the Empirical Church developed? What are these marked recent changes to the field over the last decade to which I earlier alluded? This is almost a whistle-stop tour, but it might be suggestive of some of the things that we can take up in the discussion. When I started my doctorate in 2003, as I mentioned, the secularisation paradigm, or the absence of religion institutionally and experientially in 20th century Britain, was taken for granted. Through the revisionism of Callum Brown's immensely influential book, this certainty has been sort of dislodged, at least until the 1960s, which then are a pivotal point of change in his framework around a discursive Christianity, which was looking for the ways in which religious rhetorics and repertoires continue to function in popular culture. And Brown argues that these are salient through Sunday schools and hymns and traditions and practices through the 1950s and at least until the 1960s, 1963, perhaps crucially. Hugh MacLeod's Religious Crisis of the 1960s pushed these agendas on further and importantly incorporated a study of Vatican II into these debates, thinking in a transatlantic, through a transatlantic lens. And so alongside discussions about honest to God and swinging London, we get an excavation of what's happening in this decade as a watershed. And for MacLeod, this is about the ending of Christendom rather than, and it's a crisis that's related to that. Church-state relations are dislodged for him fundamentally in that period. And revisionist research since now critiques secularisation itself, asking what it is, what it means, when it happened. Charles Taylor sort of pivotally in this, but actually some recent work from multiple avenues around post-secularisation, and as to sort of where we are now. So meanwhile, after the post-structuralist insecurities of the 1990s, history has recovered something of its confidence from these critiques, and no longer claims to speak about objectively about the past, but more modestly, in fact, is now seeking to derive meaning and to look for historical change in micro-studies, through engagement with individual experiences, and through a study of the material. And in the history of religion, this has resulted in the emergence of a new methodology that mostly is called the study of lived religion. Chief practitioners such as Nancy Amman, Meredith Maguire, Bob Orsi, taking inspiration from sociology and anthropology, but thinking about identity and identity-making practices, subjectivities, the intersectional interplay of where you are in the life cycle, gender, race, class, and the ways in which this formulates and functions in our understandings of our beliefs. And history has had a really important part to play in these approaches and debates too, thinking about the interplay of memory or tradition and the ways in which it can be mobilised to legitimate innovation in the present, as well as to resist change. So as a bit of a case study of such an approach, I'd like to speak about a project that ran between 2011 and 2014 at the University of Notre Dame, which I was privileged to be involved with too, seeking to write a lived religious history of the Second Vatican Council, convened there by the Koshma Centre. And it similarly was an attempt to move beyond these very polarising and stifling discussions about the spirit of Vatican II, or Benedict XVI's sort of loaded hermeneutics of continuity. So the result, which is just out, I think sort of 6 months or so ago, is a recently published book, Catholics in the Vatican II Era, Local Histories of a Global Event, and it incorporates 12 case studies of the impact of the Council across Asia, Europe, and North and South America. So my own sort of contribution within it is thinking about the histories of the Vernacular Society and the Latin Mass Society, and the ways in which both organisations, advocates of change and those resistant to it, mobilised Catholic history, a rhetoric of the Reformation, and a legacy of the Elizabethan martyrs, the 40 martyrs, to contest or to endorse movement to the vernacular. So history, memory, and its salience 300 years on at play. And the book is looking at how effectively the Council was experienced, how it was received, and how it was implemented. So, where are we going now? What are some of the future directions that might sort of be identified, having sort of thought about the debates over the last decade? I think following a critique of secularisation, a more textured historicisation of the Council, and some of these methodological interventions and innovations around lived religion, the new scholarly horizons are quite exciting. And there are two areas that I'd like to highlight. These, of course, are my very personal idiosyncratic sort of identification, but there is a theme of scholarship to suggest that they also maybe constitute a more general direction of travel. And the first, I think, is the recovery of the theological, or a recognition of the need to take the religious seriously as a category of analysis, or an ideological commitment, and the way that that needs to be incorporated into what scholars now call an intersectional analysis. Class, race, gender, and religious belief in that conversation, and a conversation that the humanities itself needs to engage with. Now this, as I mentioned at the outset, requires, I think, quite a lot of conversation across disciplines, quite a lot of collaboration, arguably. Some of the projects on pilgrimage in this vein deliberately have a theologian that they've brought into the mix of the project, but also this process of translation. Because in fact, that kind of theological literacy required to really take the religious seriously means that you need to, if not inhabit that world, have a sense of what's at stake and the sorts of languages and rhetorics that people are using. One area in which I think there's some really interesting work, and there was a prime example of it in the panel this morning, is in the history of gender and sexuality. And in terms of thinking about the work that's happening in history per se, historians like Sue Morgan and Joanne de Groot, Matt Cox, Dominic James, and the Anglican priest Mark Chapman have made sort of crucial interventions very most recently in this field. So my own sort of sense to actually sort of build into this sort of new intellectual agenda is through a recent publication. I'll sort of have a bit of self-promotion here. It came out last month. And this publication is seeking to address what I am now convinced is a profound historical amnesia about the 1960s. And an amnesia that means that discussions about this start with the theology of the body and don't excavate what was happening in the 40s and 50s. This has always been at the sharp edge of interpretations of the Second Vatican Council. If we think about Gary Metzbase's reflections on married love. But of course, the really interesting thing is the ways in which contemporaries would talk about the Catholic medico-moral code. And that's the language they used in the 50s in terms of negotiating what you might see as the gender trouble before John Paul II. And here I'm calling this very tentatively, it's a work in progress, but I'm calling it a Catholic sexology. Sexology being, of course, the ways in which knowledge around reproductive sort of technologies and the body are developing through science and medicine in this period. That discovery of some hormones that, again, Jared talked about this morning, and where the discussion and the debate was at in the 1930s, 40s and 50s. And the contribution that a cadre of Catholic doctors, mostly men, but some women, were seeking to make into our knowledge of fertility, the female reproductive cycle, and effectively in faithful critics of the church, taking up Casti Connubii and the Oration to the Midwives in 1951, and trying to actually use science to make the rhythm method more reliable. And actually whether that was a worthwhile debate was also some of the discussions that they were having. So in this current volume, I've brought together sort of an edited collection. Of course, I'm hoping it's sort of rather timely with the 50th anniversary of Humanae Vitae upon us in July. And it's a study of 14 different European contexts and a strand of progressive Catholicism that I think is forgotten or obscured by the 1970s in the movement to the right in the church thereafter and the kind of sexual politics that tend to characterise 1970s, 1980s Catholicism. So we're actually sort of trying to frame these studies. I'm going to talk for a long time about the difficulties of putting 14 different national contexts together, finding academics who could talk around across the history of sexuality and the history of Catholicism or history of religion and the like. But actually framing it has meant too that there is a need for theological analysis around things like the Pontifical Commission and the majority and minority reports, around the modulation of natural law through this period, and the ways in which a personalist theology created resources for faithful Catholics, but critical Catholics or questioning Catholics, to try to negotiate the bounds of how far you could go, if you want to, if you forbid that. So actually sort of trying to integrate and expressly sort of foreground something in the theological has been an important part of that process. And I spoke about the volume about a fortnight ago in Belfast at the European Social Sciences History Conference in a history of sexuality stream, and I was acutely aware of having to do some of that sort of gentle exploratory mapping before I could talk about the intervention the volume was making, because of this theological sort of illiteracy that one is speaking into. It's also a work of social and cultural history, so it's not an institutional history, it's not a church history. There are bishops in it and episcopal conferences in it, but I wanted it to be a history of the laity and the laity's experience and response to the changes and the tumult of the 1960s, and particularly the Encyclical. So my own chapter within it has excavated letters to Cardinal Heenan in the 1960s, about 300 odd. The cascade of letters to the editor in the Catholic and secular press. The editor of the Times complained to Heenan that it was the most letters ever received on a single issue in July and August of 1968. But also, I'm, as part of that project, conducting some oral history interviews with dissident, former or non-active priests, depending on how they conceive of their ministry now. Thinking about the autobiographical vein that we've moved from, there is an interweaving of my own personal history, I guess, in part within this. In the acknowledgements, I talk about it being dedicated to my deceased mum and dad, who lived and loved in the shadow of Humanae Vitae. So I'm coming to this as an intensely post-conciliar Catholic and one who wasn't part of that event, but has been inculcated in part in the church that was left behind in the wake of it. And I would actually argue, and I've been thinking quite a lot about whether it would be possible to undertake such a study within a theology department. In a history department, I wonder whether in the theological department the need to actually sort of move to abstractions, the extent to which my freedom of manoeuvre and analysis may have felt more pressured, or the kind of interventions that I'm making may be more provocative. So here, thinking through that how far can you go point of my presentation, the kind of boundary crossing and the role of academic freedom to pursue these agendas is something that I've reflected on quite a lot in coming to this panel. And this is, of course, dangerous territory. The oral histories that I'm conducting as a sort of a middle-aged Catholic woman, but speaking to older men, former non-active priests, about their sexuality, about their movement out of the institution into marriage, or their descent around Humanae Vitae. It's a very emotional territory, it's fragile territory, it's intimate territory, but I think it's really important territory too in terms of preserving that memory. And actually, the study of the impact of Humanae Vitae and in fact the council on the clergy from that perspective, with over 100 odd leaving each year, is something I think we need to do more work on before we can't do work on it in terms of using an oral history methodology. I'm asking questions within the book about the role of women and the laity in particular within the church. And there are continuing questions that I think are raised in some of these interventions about women's role and place and the respect that they're accorded within the church in these debates. So, another intervention there. But also the importance, I would argue, of the empirical, the actual lives, the responses, the resistance, the compliance, the issue of the sensus fidelium, this gap between the magisterium and magisterium that was almost gestured at this morning. And the ways in which a sort of a lived experience of marriage, marital intimacy, the difficulties of family life, and ultimately decisions and choice making around contraception is something that I'm wanting to recover. So also this fusion of the gendered history within the history of religion and theology. My second new agenda is stimulated by the dynamics of the post-secular, or the renewed but also fraught interest in Christianity as a foil to with a fear or fascination chiefly with Islam. And here the role of religion in the history of forced and voluntary migration has attracted some attention over the last 5 years or so. Actually out of geography, oftentimes, but also Anna's work, of course. And it brings me to what I think is a second case study of where this post-secular, religiously plural society might lead us. So my second example is around what I'm terming, what others have termed, in fact I haven't coined it, of a vernacular theology. There was a Berkeley conference recently around this theme. And it centres on the work that I've done on the religious diversity, or for some time on the religious diversity of East London in the context of the post-Second World War period, and some surprising and inspiring examples of everyday inter-religious conviviality or syncretism, a devotional creativity that one finds in these, what some academics would call hyper-diverse contexts. And I think this requires us to inform ourselves about other religious traditions. So again, this issue of various literacies mean that this work, and work that in fact I'm contemplating going forward, will require me to learn much more about other religious traditions about which I know very little. My next project is going to be on the role of faith organisations in anti-racist agendas in the 1960s and 70s, which I think will mean that I need to discover much more about Pentecostalism, but also Santeria and Rastafarianism. So anyway, back to this case study, which is looking at devotion to St Anthony in Forest Gate in East London. And here I was intrigued to find, with some work just on that parish, that Tamil Catholics and Tamil Hindus, both living in that area, in the borough of Newham, shared inter-religious devotions that they were importing from their home context in the diaspora. And these involved walking on knees, petitions to the Master, and indeed shared Eucharist around the Novena to St Anthony. So you need to imagine a Tuesday evening in Forest Gate, and here's the actual shrine that's there. It was donated in the late 1890s by an Irish Catholic woman, and that other image is the actual shared pilgrimage space in Tamil in India. Around 300 people, a mixed setting, a context, a church that was originally Irish Catholic but now is intensely diverse, including Ghanaians, Nigerians, Filipinos, but also a really large and dynamic Irish traveller community. And every Tuesday evening, around 200 or so people sort of come for the novena, but also have household shrines that they use during the week. I undertook a sort of sociological study of the prayer life of those that were engaging in devotion to St Anthony there, this extra liturgical, and with permission of the priest, was able to analyse the prayers posted on a Tuesday evening over the course of a month, some of which are actually read out in the service too, and actually read out in different languages in the service. And what emerged from that was a fascinating study, I think, for me anyway, of the diverse socio-economic problems that were brought to St Anthony, the migratory issues that were negotiated through that devotion, the extent to which education and relationships were discussed sort of there, and the intimate sort of faith life that the saint was supporting. So contradicting narratives about Vatican II and the demise of devotional cultures, here we have a persistence of something of that creativity and vibrancy, but it's happening under the radar. So to conclude, how far can you go into areas for research, into methods, into interventions into different disciplines? I think quite a long way. The current sociology of Catholicism is a hybrid approach. It's challenging a purely institutional focus or doctrinal certainties, as well as polarised factions within contemporary Catholicism. And it takes place in diverse faculties and diverse institutions, and it is all the richer for it. Ethnographic, historical, spatial and material methodologies challenge binaries and neat, smug descriptions of what the Church is. They illuminate doctrinal diversity, an ever-present but often unacknowledged spectrum of beliefs and practices. And most importantly, such an approach foregrounds the laity, moving towards an understanding of the Church as an inverted pyramid, or a synodal teaching and learning church, which Pope Francis advocated in 2015. So thinking about Lodge's novel, the ways in which those sort of almost very idealised sort of Catholics were wrestling with the council and asking questions about how to live and love in the post-conciliar church. I think if we look similarly at the grassroots and illuminate the everyday, we encounter weeds, but also new shoots, stony ground, but also places that have borne fruit within the contemporary Catholic Church. Thank you.
And I'd like to briefly introduce in a more formal way Dr. Tricia Bruce, before she then talks to you more extensively about her biography. So Dr. Tricia Bruce is an Associate Professor of Sociology at Maryhill College in the US. She specialises in the sociology of religion, particularly the sociology of Catholicism. Her books include Parish and Place, Polarisation in the US Catholic Church, and Faithful Revolution, as well as a more recent book, in fact forthcoming book, on American parishes. She holds a PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a joint appointment with the University of Texas at San Antonio, and has led research for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. So Tricia, thank you for coming and putting up with the jet lag, and we're very much looking forward to hearing what you've got to say.
It can be said that the first wisdom of sociology is this: things are not what they seem. Social reality turns out to have many layers of meaning, writes Peter Berger, sociologist, in 1963. Of course, the discovery of things yet unseen can be unnerving. It's hardly a benign endeavor. Berger himself acknowledges this. He says, quote, "People who like to avoid shocking discoveries, who prefer to believe that society is just what they were taught in Sunday school, should stay away from sociology. People who feel no temptation before closed doors, who have no curiosity about human beings, who are content to admire scenery without pondering about the people who live in those houses on the other side of the river, should probably also stay away from sociology. They will find it unpleasant, or at any rate, unrewarding." Even more pointedly, Berger says, the sociological perspective is like a demon that possesses one, that drives one compellingly again and again to the questions that are its own. An invitation to sociology is therefore an invitation to a special kind of passion. No passion is without its dangers. The sociologist who sells his wares, or her wares, should make sure that he or she clearly pronounces a caveat emptor quite early in the transaction. Buyer beware. Buyer beware. Today, I'll extend an invitation to sociology of Catholicism. Like sociology overall, it too is a special kind of passion that carries its own dangers. Buyer beware. But why? What is so scary about sociology, or the sociological imagination as it engages Catholicism? To see this, we have to look back. We have to explore where sociology of Catholicism has been, where it is now, and then think too about some of the prospects that it holds for understanding the Catholic world today. Today I will derive some of these examples both from myself, my own journey, but also that of others as they have entered into this space. And I'm warning now, right? Buyer beware, right? The goods that are sold here, there are no refunds for this exploration. You've been warned. Warning. Right? This suspicion about really sociology in general is rooted pretty deeply in the field's origins. In the US context, the sociology of Catholicism emerged most pointedly around the 1930s, really amidst a suspicion of the sociology of religion itself, or we could say even more pointedly, a suspicion of sociologists who studied religion. There was this elusive ideal of value neutrality, as though we could study society apart from ourselves, to be able to separate, to apply the tools of positivism to the study of society. It seemed as though sociologists of religion were defining this core disciplinary tenet. The message here being that sociology and normative thought were essentially incompatible. In fact, many sociologists of religion and sociologists of Catholicism in particular were discriminated against in their own field, such that they didn't feel comfortable attending some of their conferences and felt as though they needed a space in which they could find kindred conversation apart from discrimination. It was for this reason that the American Catholic Sociological Association, the American Catholic Sociological Review began in 1938. This would later become what is now the Association for the Sociology of Religion, but it actually was rooted in a group of Catholics who formed this initial association. And normative, it was. Even some of the early writing and scholarship that came out of the American Catholic Sociological Review looked at what might be called the problems rampant, particularly in the Catholic American context. The immigrant problem, the problem of leakage, I love this term, leakage from the church. Okay. This term is not really used as much anymore. The problem of discrimination against Catholics in a predominantly American Protestant milieu. In fact, sociologists are pretty good at naming problems. They pointed out especially the problems that might emerge when we look at this interplay of agency, individuals, and structure, right? The broader context in which we operate. Sociologists are attentive to those levels of macro and meso and micro. Right? The meso level in particular draws our attention to that space between what could be considered sort of individual Catholicism and individual Catholics' experience of their faith and the church, the institutional church. The meso level asks, well, where does that happen? One place where that happens, of course, is through parishes. Much of my work has centered around parishes and thinking about what is the role of parishes in mediating really between individuals and the church. So when I look back to these early sociologists of Catholicism, I asked too, well, how did they think about parishes? What did they discover? And here's one of these rabble-rousers here. This is Joseph Fichter, Father Fichter. Like many who pursued the sociology of Catholicism at the time, he was both priest and practitioner. But his Harvard PhD in sociology was not enough to ward off this greater suspicion toward him and his scholarship. He wanted to ask some questions about parishes. So he took these questions into the heart of New Orleans, selected a parish in order to understand to what extent, this is his words, his question, does the informal practice of Catholicism differ from the formal expectations of the official church? So the parish he thought was a natural place to ask this kind of question to elicit this tension. He got permission from the local bishop in New Orleans and the pastor, and he went with 10 research assistants to engage in field research, interviews, and surveys. He quoted later writing about this, they were everywhere, watching everything, talking with everyone. So he asked about Catholic practices, beliefs, attitude toward the Catholic hierarchy, racial integration, and more. Now his findings, Fichter's findings, revealed a surprising thread of Catholic autonomy. Parishioners who didn't attend Mass as often as they might say that they did, who didn't believe as closely as they professed, who didn't practice in line with what the pastor instructed each Sunday. You'll notice here that this, and it's a little bit hard to read the title, but the result of this publication, or this research, was the publication called Southern Parish, Dynamics of a City Church. And what it's fuzzy up there, but it says Volume 1. You may wonder too, well, where are the rest of the volumes? In fact, it was meant to be a 4-part series. that would dive into these questions. Well, what happened is that he came out with these findings and people got upset. They were disturbed by this disconnect between the expectations or even hopes of what the church was and then the practices and actual behaviors and indications of individual Catholics. So the remaining volumes of his study were suppressed. They never came out. Father Fichter continued in his sociological explorations of Catholic life throughout his career, but the damage had been done. The warning had come loud and clear. Even if the exploration was accepted, the findings seemed incongruent and were met with skepticism at best or rejection at worst. So we proceed from there, but with caution, right? This problem identifying that sociologists do is now seen to be problem causing. Now, pointing out the disconnect is in fact itself a problem. This has continued to define sociological queries since Fichter. We heard yesterday some of the themes about the diagnostic, the need to ask questions, to diagnose. Sociologists, in part, are doing this kind of diagnostic work. They name the problem, but perhaps they themselves are seen as the problem. Critical realists have done some of this work in really unpacking the central task of science as gaining this empirical grasp of actual events in the world. But how, right? And why? Making this a little personal, why would I get into this? Why would I enter this space that already had this reputation and suspicion? My own Catholic imagination, we saw that Andrew Greeley reference in Alana's talk, started pretty early on. That's me. This is my first communion picture. My parents still see me exactly that way. Still talk to me as such. Catholicism, a deep part of my identity, my own imagination. To me, my Catholic world was not stagnant, but it was consistent. It shaped my own collective experiences as a child of someone in the army, moving around several different states in the United States, also living in West Germany for a time, and then landing largely in San Antonio, a city that has a rich Hispanic Latino presence, rich Catholic presence, and diversity on many fronts. I was in the choir, I was in the youth group, I taught vacation Bible school and the like. I came to appreciate through this the rich diversity of religion, but also religion in context, and how it got shaped in the collective across different places and with different people, across lines of race, across lines of difference. I would fall into what sociologists of Catholicism count as the millennial generation, right, depending on how you count it, which meant that I wasn't privy in a lived way to the changes of Vatican II. My generation took the church for granted in many ways. Under the 26-year leadership of Pope John Paul II, the church wasn't radically changing during my adolescence and lifetime. It had changed. It had gone through this massive change and was feeling the after effects of that. But we didn't witness that revolution in place. But in early 2002, it became readily apparent that the change in the church was very much so unfinished. Perhaps fearing this reprimand of queering the very structures of the church, those structures had enabled some horrific abuse. The timing of these revelations in the U.S. context were overlapped with my time in graduate school as a doctoral student. And so what I ended up studying for my dissertation, which became my first book, was a movement of lay Catholics who was responding to the crisis of abuse in the church, asking about the very structure of the church and the nature of that change. Ironically, some of the challenges that most of the faithful face were similar to those that early Catholic sociologists had faced in terms of great suspicion of their own Catholic identity, a lack of acceptance in parishes or dioceses, and public maligning, rejection of who they were as Catholics. Asking these questions, of course, is a risky endeavor. For me, too, this was a risky terrain. There was one religious sister from my home church actually made a comment to my mom and said, "Are you sure she should be asking these questions or even hanging out with the people who are part of this movement? Maybe that seems like a bad idea." In another context, I started to do some interviews in a parish context, had notified the pastor and had a conversation in advance of that. But then once the interviews began, they circled the wagons and said, stop asking questions. We don't want you to ask any questions. The invitation to sociology of religion is not merely an invitation to trouble, though, and a stymied research agenda. It is, in fact, an invitation to what might be considered a world-altering perspective, right? To see or acknowledge what one has not seen previously, to gain knowledge. There's so much potential there. It's a hermeneutic, it's a tool, it's a disciplinary bridge for a broader understanding of sociology. So how do we use this tool, then what might this look like, including much of the work that the Center for Catholic Studies, too, is now advancing conversationally and in its research queries. There's a great value in empirical data, especially on religion. You know, we make certain claims or presumptions about the practice of religion, but how do we know it when we see it? Sociologists are able to provide some of these tools in terms of interviews and in terms of surveys, in terms of attitudinal understanding of trends over time. It means, for example, talking about things like marriage and family while recognizing that the age at first marriage, at least in the US context, is higher than it ever has been. That fewer than half of Americans are now married, that marriage is becoming increasingly an institution of the elite, that fertility rates have reached an all-time low. It means considering models of intergroup relations while knowing that a third of Catholics, American Catholics, are foreign-born, that the US is more racially and ethnically diverse than ever. This is lived religion, right? These are religious lives. Yesterday we heard Karen Kilby note this question of, well, how do we know, should have drawn upon Ron, or whatever the cause may be for leaving the Catholic Church? Well, sociologists are asking this kind of question too. How do we know? We ask. Some of the work that I've done on this front, just a few examples. And here, the examples from my own experience are ones that exist not in a silo, but in partnership and across disciplinary spaces. Up here you'll see on the left an example of a project that was commissioned actually by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops in their desire to author a pastoral plan geared toward Asian American Catholics. They wanted to have the sociology to understand what was the American experience for Asian American Catholics in the US. So did a nationwide study that resulted in that, and then that pastoral plan is now will be voted upon this summer. Other work too in conversation across these siloed spaces on polarization. How do we understand the nature of divides and conflict in the church? We have to bring into the conversation theologians, sociologists, journalists, others who ask this from different perspectives. On parishes too, my book Parish in Place asks questions about diversity in the context of parishes, and how is it that the church is responding to diversity, creating pockets of specialization in order to accommodate Catholics in response. And then this is actually just out this month from American Catholic Studies. There's a special forum in here that I edited on studying parishes in studies of American Catholicism. So what is it that we see by asking these kinds of questions and open up these new spaces of inquiry? Part of what we see, of course, is the illumination of structure, right? The structure of Catholicism. Notions of structure can cut across disciplinary lines in creative ways. There's good work being done on this notion of structural sin, social sin. We heard from both John Paul and Benedict references to the structures of sin. And theologians and others have written about how in order to understand social structures, we have to also engage the discipline that specializes in their study, which is sociology. The work of theologian Kristen Heyer and others emphasizes this. You can't just locate the idea of sin in the individual. Sociologists, of course, have been pushing the idea of structure as mattering for some time. We need to be more intentional about bridging these connections and having this conversation so that we can translate the language and the jargon across different spaces where the empirical and the observable meet the less empirical and the non-observable. Again, drawing from the more recent work of critical realism, sociologist Christian Smith is one who argues that scientific inquiry as a project should be concerned about these structured properties of causal relations and mechanisms. You know, it's doing more to push this notion of meeting the empirical and the non-empirical. But this too, of course, comes with a warning. Right? Sociologists shouldn't pretend that they are theologians anymore, that theologians should pretend that they're sociologists. A brain surgeon can appreciate the heart without operating on the heart. We have to be well trained. We have to talk to each other. We have to create spaces of shared understanding in order to work together. What happens when we take sociology more seriously and social science and the empirical more seriously when studying Catholicism? Well, part of the fear, right, goes back to this revelation that in fact both agency and structure matter, this revelation that unpacking and acknowledging these broader spheres, the power to understand, can be unsettling. And it also is a great space from which to effect change. Paul Murray's work on this has been instrumental in terms of thinking about individuals as agents of change. Sociologists are actors in this. If you stay at the individual level, you're missing this larger structural component of change. I attended last weekend in Emmitsburg, Maryland, the meetings of the American Catholic Historical Association. And Baltimore Archbishop William Laurie gave the homily during a beautiful mass there at Mount St. Mary's. And he writes in this, or he spoke at the time, "The persons, events, and cultures that you study with all academic rigor are part of the mystery for the Father's plan of redemption revealed in Christ, a plan that unfolds as the ages run their course." Of course, Paul Murray noted yesterday in his talk that part of this is poetic idealism, but it's also messy reality. Right? There is this space in which when that mystery unfolds, it can be uncomfortable. Archbishop Laurie also said, "The fruits of research, publication, and teachings are part of the great mystery of a humanity redeemed, yet still working out its redemption in fear and trembling." What does this mean for the rest of us? It means asking hard questions vis-a-vis risk, commitments, professional aim. It means situating oneself in what could be a politicized terrain with stakes. As the late Andrew Greeley commented at one point, "The church did not need a sociologist and in fact did not want one. I found the sociology fascinating and rewarding. As far as the service of the church, I should have stayed home," is what Greeley said. But the Center for Catholic Studies at Durham is one beautiful example of where and how fruitful engagement is possible. And we have to engage these in context. Even Peter Berger himself changed his theories and ideas of society over time because society changed, the empirical evidence changed, and he had to be cognizant of that. So, caveat emptor, or investment worth the risk. Sociology takes off the blinders to enable us to effect change, to realize the fullness of our commitments, faith and otherwise. But we do have to ask, for what, with what consequence, with what risk, and in service of what good and what reward. Thank you.
Thank you, Tricia. Thank you for that. So much that I found so rich and informative and chimed so much with my own thinking. Our email exchanges sort of, meant that we built a virtual relationship, and now I can sort of see why those intellectual conversations are so fruitful. Couple of thoughts really, sort of riffing off sort of a number of the lines of analysis that you've identified. The first is thinking about your insight about needing to study religion in context and to look through the ways in which that context changes, but also within the plurality of that context too, through difference. And I guess this made me sort of think a bit about as people who do empirical work, as sociologists, as people who are asking questions along the ground through either ethnographic or anthropological methodologies, how do we gain access to those contexts? We talked a bit about gatekeepers and circling the wagons, but basically building bridges between the grassroots and where we are in the academy, which actually can be very sort of alienating dialogue, so some ways and thinking about whose voices we hear and how we can hear those voices too, particularly if we're speaking through difference. So I was thinking about some of the strands of your own work on parishes and the gendered dimensions, or if there are gendered inflections to some of those differences. but also thinking about the linguistic difficulties, in fact, in actually sort of speaking into a context that is so plural oftentimes. So first thought. Another thinking about the disciplinary boundaries that we're wanting to press against and either bridge or subvert, dissolve, but have the difficulties in that. I was sort of struck between both of our presentations about the sort of language we were using for what we were doing, and of course, I guess your sociological background, my historical background, the kind of language about what we're doing is it being either practical theology, or is it empirical social science, or is it oral history. So effectively acknowledging in these translations across disciplinary boundaries and into speaking of different contexts, what are some of the methodological differences that we need to identify, and indeed the strengths of these specialities, as well as the commonalities that mean that these conversations are possible. I was really struck about your insights about the spaces for conversation and how precious here is as a space for conversation, but how we can nurture other spaces for conversation too, particularly in the British context where this is so rare, but there should be other places. And then also really struck by your insight in a way about sociology as a vocation and what that means, almost thinking about Weber's politics as a vocation, the ways in which there is a ministry perhaps, or a service to the church that the sociologist, the historian of religion, the theologian lay theologian is doing, but the ways in which that oftentimes isn't perceived as that, or certainly acknowledged as that. So I might stop there, but initial thoughts.
Thanks, and I'd love to make this conversational too, so I want to throw all of those questions back at you. Because, I think that one thing that I appreciate about this conversation and the way that you approach your work and your talk today is we acknowledge ourselves in our work in a way that is, I think, fruitful and needed, and sometimes, some of the certainly in the context of sociology, there was this idea that you could remove yourself from your work and study society as a petri dish, and your positionality doesn't matter. But I think what we hear in this in part is that positionality matters quite a bit. It matters both in the questions that you ask, right? How you ask the questions, who you can ask the questions of. You ask about ideas of access too. I did it in this book. I have a methodological appendix. And in this, I comment how rare it was for me in this study, especially the first study was largely interview-based with lay Catholics, many of whom were older, pre-Vatican and Vatican II women, many of them, although it was certainly mixed in terms of gender. But this book, I was predominantly interviewing priests and bishops, so celibate men. And so sitting down to have this conversation, and then what kinds of access you have, and then the kinds of questions you're asking, I think raise things too. But it says something about our field also. Who's asking the questions, and what questions are missed if we don't diversify the question askers. And to the extent that we run up against gatekeepers or places and spaces that we can't get into. Language is another one. So the survey that I did of Asian American Catholics was translated into 13 languages. But even then, it was terribly difficult. How do you ask about, say, experiences of discrimination in another language? In some cases, there's a cultural disconnect for which there are no words. Certainly the work that Anna does as well in terms of understanding migrants and migration experience, how do you gain access to that? And just someone asking the questions. I think to me matters quite a bit. I was curious on your front too to think about, you mentioned that you have the space as a historian to explore, and I wonder if being in a history department it shapes or enables a kind of freedom for the work that you do that other contextual disciplinary spaces wouldn't, or how do institutional contexts and disciplinary contexts perhaps also limit or enable how we do this work. And I also wonder, you know, as we build this narrative, this space of positionality for the pursuit of the study of Catholicism, is that something that you think needs to be pushed more, or do researchers need to better acknowledge where they're coming from as far as their own commitments vis-a-vis whether it's the institution or their faith or their paradigms or whatnot, and what might that look like if scholars do that?
Shall I respond? Yes. Yes? No?
Yeah, if you're
yes.
loud.
Okay, very, very. And I think for me it is an open question about what difference it makes doing the work that I do in the context of the history department. And I've been at King's since January 2015. It's sort of quite a new appointment for me, and I don't have a full answer to that. What I have noticed is the extent to which, actually Paul will stand out there, there's a new book on Immigrant Problem that people here have got chapters in, and I can't put it on my ref statement. It's completely irrelevant from the perspective of my department. So there's a whole raft of what I'm doing in terms of writing for the Catholic press or the like that just doesn't count and really is in some ways can't be made visible within my institutional setting, and that's just how it is. But simultaneously, in terms of academic freedom, I do think because introducing religion as a category of analysis into an intersectional methodology in social and cultural history, and particularly the history of sexuality, because this is so new and novel, I'm relatively unfettered, and I don't feel the press of having to, the extent to which inevitably what I'm finding is politicised and is a hot potato and is problematic. In the context that I'm speaking into, it's all just so novel that I don't feel that I'm having to negotiate between certain parameters and certain bounds. So there is that freedom. As to issues around our own reflexivity as scholars and our own positionality, I guess in terms of oral history practice, which I'm drawing upon, and even social and cultural history after this post-structural crisis of the 90s that I alluded to, oftentimes in many of the histories that I've been most inspired by, usually at the beginning there's an acknowledgement of one's own investment and engagement with the materials. So in some ways I think there's a freeing up of a place to actually sort of think about, a swapping off of any aspiration to the normative and the objective, which means that we can acknowledge where we're coming from, and therefore the sorts of questions that we are asking, allowing other people to identify those that we're not.
I might just add one thing on the question of secularisation and positionality that just comes to mind from thinking about some of my own research recently. I've been conducting research with the Jesuit Refugee Service in the East End of London, working with migrants who are destitute, so judged by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation benchmarks for destitution. And one of the really interesting things in bringing a theologian in to do empirical work, strangely, is that you realise that the secularisation thesis is not only deeply embedded in academic institutions, but also actually in organisations, including faith-based organisations. Yeah. So one of the really interesting things that happened was by coming in as a theologian to do the interviews, migrants who spoke very freely about faith, who were coming largely from non-Western contexts, would speak very readily about the role of faith in their everyday practice and in the reality of negotiating destitution and the Home Office systems. When I came to present my findings back to the team at the Jesuit Refugee Service, and I know they wouldn't mind me saying this, the paid staff were stunned that religious narratives were part of what was being said by people that they work with day in, day out. And they said to me, well, this is really interesting because they don't talk to us, our own guests don't talk to us about this. Why do they not talk to us about this? And that prompted a really interesting discussion about their own assumptions about faith, about the privatisation of faith. and the possibility of the spaces where it can happen. So the secularisation thesis is alive and well, I think, in wider institutional context, and actually coming in as a theologian doing empirical research, created a possibility for those migrants for whom religious narratives are absolutely part of their public everyday lives as well as their private devotional lives. So just made me think about positionality and the secularisation thesis in a different way.